All right, welcome everyone to our webinar, our Black Lives Matter webinar. We are excited to spend some time with you today and unpack the origins of racism in the United States and the history of police brutality. We would first like to thank everyone to the space and thank you for joining. Okay. So first we will be talking about the history of oppression.
Okay, so starting off with the history of oppression of African Americans, there was the start of slavery in America, and these slaves were first brought from Africa as like a source of labor in the South, and they were originally unsuccessful. But then, due to the cotton gin, more and more slaves started being transported from Africa to America. But the concept of slavery originally came from European countries. So slaves were treated inhumanely through whipping, lynching, and rape. And it was so impactful that its ideas and concepts remain with us today, including many of the terms that we currently use, such as slaving away, or the nursery rhyme or childhood song, Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo. That all originally started from slavery. Moving on to the 13th Amendment, which stated that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but the status of African Americans was still in question. The Southern, formerly known Confederate States, enacted a series of laws called the Black Codes, and these were designed to restrict African Americans and ensure their availability as a labor force. This also went along with sharecropping and keeping them at the lower part of the economic scale. White Southerners showed a steadfast commitment to ensure their supremacy and the survival of their plantation agriculture. You can do the next slide. And then following 13th Amendment, there was the 15th Amendment, which stated that the right of citizens in the United States, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition. So following the 15th Amendment, many white protective societies emerged, and this was due to the fact that many white Southerners felt their control diminishing. And one of the most notable white protective societies was the KKK. They sought to disenfranchise African American voters by using their voter suppression. It often led to intimidation and extreme violence. It's estimated that the KKK performed over 3,500 racially motivated lynchings in the South. They disassembled African American community organizing initiatives like the one from Freedmen's Bureaus. They also restricted African American economic autonomy and restricted their support of their businesses. And the picture here is the picture of the KKK and their basically like their group gatherings. So following that, there was the Jim Crow laws, and this was one of the first segregation acts that was enacted in 1885. And they came to serve as a derogatory term for African Americans throughout years after. And this law required basically persons of color to be separated from white people in any public place. And this was justified with the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which allowed for the concept of separate but equal. And this caused a lot of segregation all throughout the United States in every public place, usually giving African Americans the worser conditions than they did for the whites. So moving on, we have the Tulsa Massacre. And this occurred in 1921 when a young African American man, Roland, was in the elevator with a white woman. And many accounts of what occurred became exaggerated with each telling. So many people thought that this was due to the account of rape or any sort of sexual harassment, even though there possibly is not, that did not occur. And this, following World War I, Tulsa was recognized for its great African community known as the Greenwood District. In 1921, that occurred, and soon after, Greenwood was looted and burned by many white rioters. Governor Robertson declared a martial law, and the National Guard troops arrived in Tulsa. After the violence, 35 blocks of the city block was in ruins, along with countless injured and dead. And here we have posted a video that explains more.
Let me make it full screen. There we go.
Tulsa, the African-American community in Tulsa was relatively prosperous, well-educated. I mean, they had done everything that they were supposed to do in terms of the American dream. You work hard, you save your money, you go to school, you buy property. I mean, this is what they had done under horrific conditions. I mean, when you look at the context of what Black America looked like at the time, the fact that they were able to do this is one of the things that we herald in terms of when we talk about the immigrant story, right? But instead, this created such seething resentment in Tulsa that you had Black doctors, Black attorneys, Black businessmen. I mean, in fact, this area of Tulsa was known as Black Wall Street, to give you some sense of how much it held in terms of value, in terms of esteem, in terms of worth. But that resentment in Tulsa was so intense and that it was just waiting for a spark to just ignite it. That spark was a Black messenger was delivering a message. You know, they had messengers back in the day, was delivering a message downtown. And he gets in the elevator, and there's a white woman in the elevator. I believe she was the elevator operator. And from the first floor through the third floor, I mean, the elevator may have bumped or something, and he hit her a little bit, but he didn't hit her. He just kind of brushed me. She yelled, "Rape." Now, to understand what the charge of rape means when a white woman yells rape against a Black man in this period, because part of understanding the violence that African Americans faced was to deal with the issue of what was called the sanctity of white womanhood. And that sanctity of white womanhood said that all white women had to be protected from Black beasts, so-called Black beasts. And when she yelled rape, now the charge was absolutely improbable, from the first floor to the third floor. Improbable. But it was the spark. They couldn't, because he was the son of a prominent Black business. So the police hauled him down to the station. Well, the Black elite came down to the station going, you know, this is my son, this is my boy. My son would do this. What's his bail? You know, like, oh, uppity, how dare you come down here? How dare you? And because the African American community sensed that the sense of anger and violence was rising, it wasn't one or two that came down, there were several of them that came down. Like, oh, so what, are you going to storm the jail? I said, no, but we're here for justice. We're here for justice. And then the lynch mob began to form in Tulsa. It's like, oh, these are some uppity Negroes who need to be put back in their place. And the violence began. Black Tulsa was, the lynch mob rolled in, but they also came in airplanes, dropping bombs on Tulsa, Black Tulsa. There's descriptions and depictions of African Americans being decapitated, being forced to kneel down and just having their heads severed. There are the pictures of the strafings, of the bombings, of the shootings. Nobody's quite sure what the death toll is. But when you look at the pictures, what you see is an area that had once been thriving. What we say is the American dream, absolutely leveled by the violence, by the lynch mobs, by the airplanes, by the bombs, leveled. Black Tulsa has never recovered. As the bombings are happening, as the violence is happening, as Tulsa is on fire, the governor of Oklahoma is like, whoa, maybe, God, we should. The feds are looking up going, this is not our issue. I bet you south. Wow. Nothing we can do here. And that is so indicative of the imbalance that has happened in terms of justice, in terms of rights, in terms of the protection of basic civil and human rights for African Americans in the United States.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.
So in the continuing the history of oppression, during World War II, many African Americans fought for their freedom even while they themselves lacked certain freedoms at home. So enlisted Black and white people were organized into separate combat units, and Black servicemen were forced to combat racism within those, even as they sought to further U.S. war aims. So this became known as the double V strategy, like for the double victories that they needed to earn, both for the U.S. and for their race. Went too far. So by 1900, the unwritten color line had barred a lot of Black players from white sports teams, especially in professional baseball, and it was strictly enforced. So Jackie Robinson had signed to a Dodgers farm team, and 2 years later had moved up, making him the first African-American player to play on a major league team. Baseball began to steadily integrate following his example, with especially basketball and tennis following suit. His historic breakthrough and success made him one of the most visible African Americans, and he used this to become a representative figure for Black equality. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered its verdict in Brown versus Board of Education, and ruling unanimously that racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment's mandate of equal protection of the laws of the U.S. Constitution to any person within its jurisdiction. The landmark verdict reversed the separate but equal doctrine the court had established with Plessy versus Ferguson, and though the court's ruling had applied specifically to public schools, it implied that other segregated facilities were also unconstitutional, thus striking a really heavy blow to the Jim Crow-dominated South. Upon Rosa Parks' arrest in 1956 for her refusal to follow bus segregational rules, an activist organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association, led by the young pastor, then MLK Jr., spearheaded a boycott of the city's municipal bus company. On November 13, 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the bus company segregation seating policy unconstitutional under the equal protection of the 14th Amendment. So freedom rides. In the early 1960s, a lot of sit-in movements and freedom rides began to take birth. A group of Black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, would sit at a whites-only restaurant to protest the exclusion. To capitalize on the sit-in movement's increasing momentum, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, was founded in Raleigh, North Carolina, in April 1960. Over the next few years, SNCC broadened its influence, organizing so-called freedom rides through the South in 1961 and the historic March on Washington in 1963.
Okay, so now we move on to the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964 to enforce the constitutional right to vote, to confer jurisdiction upon the district courts of the United States, to provide injunctive relief against discrimination in public accommodations, to authorize the Attorney General to institute suits to protect public education, to extend the Commission on Civil Rights to prevent discrimination in federally assisted programs, to establish a Commission on Equal Employment Opportunity and for other purposes. Prohibited the discrimination in public places, provided for the integration of schools and other public facilities, and made employment and discrimination illegal. During this time, a prominent figure named Malcolm X was commonly thought as a radical activist, so like a bad guy, and was a crucial piece of, he was a crucial piece of the civil rights movement. He was deemed radical because his approach was so different from renowned activists such as Martin Luther King. However, their causes were the same: free Black people from the segregation and oppression of their daily lives.
Next, we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. President Lyndon B. Johnson passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This act granted Black Americans full rights to vote and abolished previous unjust measures such as literacy rates. In Mississippi alone, the percentage of Black voters increased from 5% to 60% in the very next election. This and the ideals of Malcolm X paved the way for Black Power movements of the 1960s and 70s. Next, the Black Panther Party was founded. Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, college students from Oakland, California, formed the famous Black Panther Party. The Panthers evolved into a group that fought in favor of the Black Power movement, encouraging Black Americans to demand full employment, equal housing opportunities, and control over their lives. However, in a highly segregated America, these mundane requests were viewed as radical change and resulted in a number of violent clashes with the police all across the country. The advances of the Black Power movement and Black Panther Party paved the way for Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman in Congress, and eventually the first to run for president in 1972. In the beginnings of in the 1960s, the term affirmative action was used to refer to policies and initiatives aimed at compensating for past discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. President John F. Kennedy first used the phrase in 1961 in an executive order calling on the federal government to hire more African Americans. By the mid-70s, many universities were seeking to increase the presence of minority and female faculty and students on their campuses. Although this step was one in the right direction at the time, it did face many opponents later on when people claimed that the playing field was level and wanted to ban it. In March 1991, officers with the California Highway Patrol attempted to pull an African-American man named Rodney King over for speeding on a Los Angeles freeway. After King allegedly resisted arrest and threatened them, 4 LAPD officers shot him with a taser gun and severely beat him. As outrage broke out in the Black community in LA, riots broke out all over the city, continuing into the late 20th century Black Power movement. As more and more Black Americans became government officials, the most memorable was our first Black president, Barack Obama. However, the hate crimes and racial targeting that resulted from his win were a clear indication that America's problem with race were far from solved as they are today.
Okay. So now we'll be discussing the foundations of police brutality and corruption.
Joanna, you're on mute. Sorry.
Sorry. Okay, thank you. So, to get a grasp of the goals of the Black Lives Matter movement and why it's concerned about police brutality and defunding the police, it's important to understand the history of the American police and how brutality and corruption against African Americans, especially, has resulted in what institution is today. So the police force in colonial America under British rule had been very informal, and it was privately owned military groups that served merchants who wanted protection for their ships, their cargo, and towns also used night guards to protect people walking around at night, engaging in prostitution or gambling. But the first public Boston police force was used by merchants to protect cargo or transportation. But to be honest, it wasn't really to serve the public, although it was publicly funded. It was only argued that it's supposed to be funded by taxes because it was for the greater good. And later on, as racial divides began in America and the US became very much divided by the North and South, slave patrols took over the southern states. The South was heavily, it very much relied on the slave system, which oppressed African Americans and made them do labor, and it was a very closed system that was to divide racially and oppress Black people. And so the runaway slave patrol, or the police back then in the South, was supposed to enforce these racial divides and also catch slaves that would escape to the North, seeking a better life for themselves. And because segregation or racial segregation was only ended about 60 years ago, the same ideas of the police enforcing racial divide still pervade in the Korean police force, especially in the southern states. And on the next slide, you can see a graphic of the slave patrol and the police catching runaway slaves. And after that, after the Civil War, where slavery was ended, but in the late 1800s to early 1920s, political machines took over and redefined the police force. Political machines were businessmen that were allied with political parties to repress and oppress immigrants to gain votes for their political parties. This meant that, for example, they would either threaten immigrants or minorities, or they would provide them with health care or services or supplies, but then make them vote for their political party. And this really also meant that the police was never for the people, but against the people or for corporations or political parties, and never really served and protected as it's supposed to be. And so in the 1930s, as the Great Depression hit, the professionalization of the police force began. As FDR decided with the New Deal to combat the Great Depression in America, he wanted to make the police force a government institution and make it more professional. But as crime historian Samuel Walker said, that the professionalization of the police would only create a kind of inward looking and isolated from the public force, which also meant that crime control tactics were never for the people. It was very much also for the government. So a pattern of not serving the people and serving corporations and governments were still enforced by the police force and are enforced still today.
Okay, so the beginnings of modern police brutality. The current modern police brutality kind of refers to like the militarization of the police and their current aggressive tactics in addressing crimes. And this all really began with Nixon when he declared a war on drugs. His purpose there was mainly towards crack cocaine at the time, which was a new drug that had become really popular in inner cities, which are also lower income areas with more minorities and Black people. And so with this war on drugs, he created the Drug Enforcement Administration, which was a special police force committed to targeting illegal drug use and smuggling. And again, they focused more on inner cities and areas that had higher concentrations of Black people. And they would kind of look past the crimes of white people more. And you can still see that today with the police, where they will arrest a lot of Black people more for drug crimes like marijuana use. But for white people, they'll say, like, oh, it's okay, it's just your first time, you're a good kid, don't do it again, and let them go. And then next, under Reagan, the war on drugs really became a war. He started offering huge cash grants and military equipment to law enforcement agencies that were willing to make drugs a top priority. Under Nixon, the war on drugs had kind of only been under the DEA, and the local police forces weren't really willing to make drug crimes a top priority. They were more focused on other things. But Reagan started offering them like perks to enforce these drug laws. Oh, go back a slide. Yeah, that's good. And then, because of that, he also passed the Military Cooperation with Law Enforcement Act, which encouraged the military to give police forces access to military bases, intelligence, research, weaponry, and other equipment for the war on drugs. So it really did make it a war. And again, they were mostly focusing on inner cities and areas with higher Black populations. So this affected Black populations a lot more. Then next, in the 90s, the DEA launched an operation called Operation Pipeline, which trained cops on how to use traffic stops as a pretext to search cars for drugs. So they trained them to see cars that they thought were suspicious, and then they could pull them over, claiming that it was a traffic stop, and then demand to search the car for drugs. And of course, because of pre-existing biases, this ended up only being, if you saw a Black person, you would be more likely to think they have drugs on them for no other reason than their race. And then you would pull them over, and this tends to be the reason for a lot of cases of police killings that are during traffic stops, where normally you wouldn't require people to get out of the car or to search the car. But because of this, police started using traffic stops for other reasons, and then they would get more aggressive once people would refuse to comply, because it's ridiculous when you're stopped for speeding to be asked to see if you have drugs in the car. And then Bill Clinton then campaigned with this idea of being tough on crime. And with this, he introduced a lot of new legislation and enforced pre-existing laws. And one of those was the 3 strikes you're out rule, which meant that if you got 3 misdemeanors, you would then be charged with a felony. And this meant that you would get much longer prison time. And this caused a lot more prisons to be filled with Black people. And if you get charged with a misdemeanor, usually misdemeanors are not big crimes and felonies are a lot bigger. But now if you get charged with 3 crimes that aren't very big, suddenly you're being given a lot more jail time than you deserve. And along with that, he also passed a massive crime bill, which made a lot of crimes now federal crimes, which also gave you more jail time, put you in federal penitentiaries. And he authorized billions of dollars of funding for prisons and police forces. And the crime bill that he introduced also mandated life sentences for some 3-time offenders where the original crime did not require a life sentence. And that bill is considered to be the cause for the large disparity in the prison population of Black people versus other groups, other races, and also why there are a lot of people in prison that really shouldn't be there. But because of all of these policies that he introduced, now there are. And then the aftermath of the drug war. We're still seeing the aftermath now, even though the idea of a war on drugs isn't really being used anymore. Now we think of it more as the opioid crisis. But we still have the aftermath of that, and it can really be seen in prison populations. They have been targeted by the drug war a lot more. Black and brown citizens have been targeted by the drug war a lot more, so they make up a much larger population of current prisons. Even though more white people use and sell drugs, there are more Black and brown people in prisons for drug crimes. And it was used as an excuse to wage war on Black Americans, essentially. And yeah, so that's where now the highly militarized, very aggressive police force comes from. Now I think it'd be a good idea to discuss kind of anybody's experiences with the police or your opinions on the police. I know a lot of people will say that they believe that Black people should have equal rights and stuff like that, but then they draw the line at condemning the police. So I think it'd be a good idea to have a discussion about that and of people's views.
Okay, so I can say for myself, well, I have never experienced racism, and I'm very privileged to not have done so. But with the police, my kind of main issue, and maybe something that you guys have an opinion on, is hidden police or like disguised police. Because I had a situation where I was walking with my friends at night through the city, and a Black car started slowing down next to us. We were on the sidewalk and it was slowing down next to us. And so we thought, okay, well, we're just gonna keep walking. Like, we don't know if those are like kidnappers, like aggressive people. We have no clue, but we're gonna keep walking. And so, like, after 2 minutes maybe of them just slowly trailing behind us, the car finally rolls down the window, and it's the police. Like, what are you guys doing at night? Like, do you guys need something? What is happening? What are you guys doing? Which, like, okay, like, fine. They're the police, like, they should patrol people, but it's also them being disguised put a lot of panic into us. And I would only assume that if we were to start running because we thought those were like kidnappers or something, we probably would have been tased or even shot because we just were running away from the police that we didn't know of. And so that's, I guess, my problem with disguised police, that something that's happening in Portland, Oregon now is a big problem. And so I was curious about if you guys had any experiences like that, or what your guys' opinions on that is.
Yeah, I've never personally had any experience with them, but I know currently what's happening in Portland. I've seen a lot of people excuse it, saying, oh, the protesters there, they've been violent. Have you seen all of the things that they've done? But to me, that doesn't seem like an excuse to have an unmarked van show up and throw you in the van, make you think that you're being kidnapped, only to say it's the police. And to me, that does not seem like a humane way that anybody should be treating the people that they're supposed to be protecting. So,
Yeah.
it seems ridiculous.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I've never experienced anything like that firsthand, but I would say, like, just hearing everything with the Black Lives Matter movement and what's going on, and just even the lootings, a lot of it has been undercover police, from what I've heard. They are trying to coerce people into doing that, coerce protesters into making the wrong decisions, just so that they can catch them red-handed. And I just feel like, you shouldn't be pressuring people to make the wrong choices, as law enforcement, and using like a, I guess masking, like, you being law enforcement and asking people to make the wrong decision just does not sit well with me.
Yeah. That I know of is, for example, putting out bricks on the street when there are protests or like riots, to kind of coerce people into saying, oh, there's like a weapon here, a brick, I can throw this. And so that's, I guess, what I know of when it comes to that.
And you guys are both completely correct, because I've seen plenty of videos and plenty of evidence of police starting the rioting, and of a lot of white people and a lot of other people who have nothing to do with the protest coming in and then starting that looting and then blaming it on Black protesters. And as a Black African American, I've been aware of the police brutality problem for a long time, because what a lot of people don't realize is that this is not new. The way the police started is, going back to the slides, is basically as slave patrols to stop slaves from running away. And if you caught them, they were either dragged back to their plantations or their owners, or they were murdered. And that's how slavery lasted so long, because they kept that field of oppression. Because one of the biggest ways how they kept Black people down so much is by erasing their culture and erasing their identities. Because if you were a slave, you weren't dictated as, oh, they're from Nigeria or they're from the Congo. No, you weren't considered human. So you were grouped under one label in one area as, okay, this is my property. These people belong to me. And so by using that and using that oppression and using those tactics, even after slavery ended, by using segregation and redlining, the war on drugs, racial profiling, Black people have always been under. Because for me, I've grown up being conditioned to notice my skin color, to notice the fact that I'm Black and that my sister's Black and that my father's Black. And when I see these countless names every day, more and more and more Black people who are being killed at the hands of the police, and seeing people still defending it and saying, oh, they were criminals, or, oh, they did this, they did that, and then not condemning the police and the white supremacists who are murdering people, it's terrifying, because that means that my father might go out driving somewhere one day, or my sister might go out driving one day, and then a police officer can pull them over and kill them and then get away with it. So I feel like that's the biggest thing, is because none of this is new. This has been happening for so long. Because slavery didn't start in America. It started centuries before that. And so I just wish people would realize that while maybe you have not been affected by this, there are millions of people who are.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people sometimes will say, oh, sure, they started like that, but slavery was over 100 years ago. That's not what they are anymore. But if you see throughout their history, they have always been in the interests of the wealthy people, in the interests of those in power, and they kept using the excuse of, it's for the greater good, we're helping the community, but they never really were. It was basically propaganda to sell them. So now it's become this cultural idea of this is what police are, but they never really were that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like, I feel like when we learn stuff in history, especially as we're younger and as we grow older, even then, we learn that the Civil War was kind of, after the Civil War, slavery was just done. It just ended abruptly like that. But, history is more complex than that. It's not just black and white like that. Slavery, the whole point of like the police started to capture runaway slaves, but even after slavery ended, they would capture Black people and like put them into prison so that they could work as slaves, because it was legally okay to have them work as slaves so long as they did something wrong. And so slavery ended in a larger sense, but Black people were still criminalized more, because it meant more working people, like people who would work for no money, just like slavery. They would work for the economy, but they wouldn't get any money, and it's benefited white people.
Yeah, I think that a crucial part of reforming the police would be heightened accountability of police officers, because it's not necessarily to reform an institution. You don't start with the individuals, like you don't catch out every pedophile in the police force. You catch the managers, the chief officers that are supposed to watch over those individuals and make them more accountable, and make them, for example, something that I think a couple of states enforced or started enforcing is that police records or like complaints against police officers became public information, which kind of makes police officers more wary and less protected in the crimes or exploitations that they might commit.
Yeah, and I think something that definitely is important in reforming the police force so that it can actually become what people think it is and what it's supposed to be is educating them more and increasing the amount of time that is training, because right now they're only being trained on like how to shoot a gun and how to protect themselves, and not really how to protect anybody else. Because if you look at other countries that have much lower rates of police killings, like a couple a year, they train their police officers for multiple years and also require them to have degrees in psychology or things like that, so that they actually understand what they are doing. Because right now, the majority of, or not the majority, but a lot of police officers never got a college degree. They came out of high school. They came from police families. So they don't really have the proper perspective to be able to protect the people they're supposed to be protecting.
Exactly, because police officers are not, it actually takes more time to become like a hairstylist in certain locations than it does to become a police officer. And there's been several laws, which not all of them are still active now. It's not just like laws, but like policies that protect officers who commit these unjust crimes, like the panic law, which there are going to be times when the police face someone and someone is going to die. That is going to happen, in shootouts, that is what happens. But several officers, like just in the last few weeks, if you look at all the Black people who have been killed and how they were killed, it was, I suspected they had a gun, or I suspected they had this, or they made me nervous, I got scared. If you panic and you cannot control your fear while holding a gun, you should not be a police officer. Because if you, a person who is supposed to protect the citizens, is a danger to the citizens, if you're going to look at someone and think, the color of their skin, they're a threat. I have to watch them. I have to kill them. You should not be a police officer. And as everyone's been saying how they need more training, they do, and they need to go through racial training, racial biasing, and they need to be held accountable. They should not just be fired for murdering someone unjustly. They need to serve time and like be serve the same amount of years that someone else, a citizen who murdered someone, would spend. Because if the people in power and the people who are supposed to stop crimes are not held accountable for their crimes, then how can you say that locking other people up is okay if not everybody's going to be held to the same standpoint? And that's just kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note that if a police officer is fired, and especially if he is a part of a police union, a work union, a job union, then he is often just relocated to a different department. It's not like he stops being a police officer, but more often than not, he's just relocated and he can continue to exploit his power just in a different place.
Like, I believe that there are a lot of officers who come into the police force to do good, and I really respect that. And it's not like individual police officers that we are worried about. We're worried about a whole, like, what the police force does as a whole, and like the foundation of the police force and what it meant before and what it's still like, what its ideals are, because that's what's hurting us. Like, it's a lot of police officers, they start out really good, but then as the more time they spend, like, you know, working as a police, the more at least this is my personal opinion, the more corrupted they start to become, and they start to become more assimilated into that like mentality, into that police mentality.
Yeah, and if you look at what their training actually consists of and accounts of people who are former police officers, you'll see a lot of what they teach is what we're doing is helping them, but they don't understand that. So when the people that we're supposed to be protecting say what we're doing is too aggressive, they just don't understand it. So it really creates this idea of kind of us and them. It polarizes the police and isolates them so that they stop kind of considering what's best for the community, and they only do what they think they should do, and they don't listen to the people that they're supposed to be protecting. And so that creates a lot of the police mentality when people start out being good people, but then they're not anymore.
Yeah, because it's not necessarily that every cop is a bad person. Of course they're not. There's tons of good cops, but it's because you can be a good person, but when there's so many bad cops and so many bad things happening, then it's kind of like, okay, yeah, there's good people, but there shouldn't be this much bad, and they shouldn't get away with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So somebody asked the question of what do you think about demilitarization of Americans in general? And I think, first of all, the demilitarization of police, I'm not sure if everybody knows this, but leftover weapons from the military, if they are not used by the military, police forces are allowed to buy those. So a lot of police forces have actual military equipment that they are using, which that equipment is created to kill people. So it's ridiculous that police forces would be allowed to have that. And then in general, just people having assault rifles, I think that's dumb. Those are also created to kill people, so why would you allow the public to have those?
It's quite literally in the name, assault rifle. Like, if you need to protect yourself, that's one thing. You know, the right to bear arms, it is our Second Amendment, and I understand where people come from when they say they want a gun to help them. Like, personally, I don't think, like, you know, if we can stay safe as a whole, there is no need for gun laws, like for guns. But having stricter gun control is definitely something I advocate for, just because no one needs an assault rifle to protect themselves. No one, because that is a semi-automatic like gun that you can shoot at multiple places in seconds and kill so many people. And hunting rifles, are like, hunting rifles, maybe, when people as like a hobby or something, when they want to go out, that's very different. But when you have an assault rifle, that's just, you don't use it for, you're not going to be using it for any, like for self-defense. It's just, that's not what it's used for.
Yeah, and then back to the police having those equipment. They don't have assault rifles, but they still have military equipment. They are heavily militarized. It's the same idea of why would you give the people who are supposed to be protecting others weapons that are made to kill? Then they're being armed to kill people. It's inevitable almost.
Yeah, and especially like we saw during the Black Lives Matter protests, even during peaceful protests when there was no looting, like police came, shot tear gas and rubber bullets. And tear gas is not even used in the military at this point. It's the fact that the police would use it on unarmed citizens, but the military won't even use it on other armies is saying something about our police force too.
You're right.
So,
oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Because technically, the US and the police have actually declared war on us, on the citizens, with how they've acted in protests, especially peaceful protests, using those tear gases and using those rubber bullets. Because, as you said, you can't use tear gas in the military. If I'm correct, I believe it's against the Geneva Code. I'm not 100% sure on that.
Yeah, the Geneva Convention says that you cannot use mustard gas and chemical weapons like that on other armies.
Right, thank you. And the way that the police, because the police are doing many things at these protests, partly to make the protesters look bad, which has to do with, the looting and, pretending, oh, protesters are doing all these things, so it justifies us attacking them. But they're literally hunting down protesters. Like chasing them down after protests are over, completely peaceful. No one's armed, no one's doing anything, and yet they're tear gassing them, arresting them, shooting them with rubber bullets. And it's not right that people who are supposed to protect you are the ones harming you. Because of course, with the Second Amendment, people have the right to bear arms. And I believe that. I believe that there's certain arms they shouldn't be able to bear, and that there should be stricter gun laws, especially depending on past use of guns and how you've used them. Because while, yes, you should be able to protect yourself, there are certain things that you don't need to protect yourself. Like, as I said before, you don't need an AK-47 to protect yourself. Like, that's a semi-automatic weapon. You do not need that in your home. But when the police have all of this military gear and are using weapons that even the military can't use, that is saying a lot about how our police is behaving and how they should not be able to behave like that.
And like also when we saw people, like a lot of white people came together and they started protesting the pandemic, and like they stopped healthcare workers from getting to their jobs and like helping people who were dying. Nothing, there was no tear gas, there were no rubber bullets, nothing happened. The police just stood there and they tried to get the protesters out of the way, but after some time they were like, okay, well, we have to, it's their freedom of speech, their right to protest. But as soon as like the Black Lives Matter movement started, then what happens? You get this tear gas, you get looting, and the first case of looting started because they wanted milk from Target. Target wouldn't provide it to them. And there was maybe one case of looting started by protesters, and that may have not even been started by protesters. But even then, like you have the police shooting at innocent, peaceful protesters with the rubber bullets and with tear gas. But isn't it our freedom of speech as well? Like, don't we have the right to protest as well without any harm coming to us?
Yeah, I think that.
Sorry, go on, Jenna.
Okay, so I also wanted to kind of point out in the situation of protests against like masks and like shutting down for COVID. I had a thought when reading the article about like people armed white people by the American Capitol. And my thought was that, what, if that was even an Arab person if that was someone of slightly darker skin, if that was even a Latino person, I think that they would have been shot on the spot with the argument that, oh, they must have been a terrorist. But because white supremacy is so engraved into American, not only American, but especially American society, I think that they weren't harmed just because of their skin color.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think the whole argument of our right to bear arms, our Second Amendment, this is something that is in the American Constitution and we all should have it. It's always, I feel that they're advocating for it just for the white people, because whenever somebody else comes with a gun, they automatically think that it's dangerous. If you look at Philando Castile, he was shot because he was pulled over because he was Black. And also, he said that he had a legal weapon in his car. And that was part of why they felt so threatened by him and ended up shooting him. But it's a legal weapon. It's something that everybody advocates for. It's our Second Amendment right. We should all be able to have it. But when it's somebody who's not white, when it's a minority that you feel threatened by, then suddenly, no, you can't have that. We're threatened by you.
It does have to do with that, the fact that they feel threatened. Well, not to say that they feel threatened, it's that they want to pass people of color, especially Black people at this time, off as threatening. But the reason why that doesn't work is because, as it was mentioned before, a group of white protesters were able to go into the state capitol, or was it? I know they were at a capitol. I can't remember exactly which one it is, and they had weapons with them. They had AK-47s. They had weapons with them, and they were screaming in the face of police, being violent, and yet we're out here protesting for our right to exist, for our right to live, and to not have to constantly be under threat that we're going to be killed or shot for literally just being. Because there's tons of names out there, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, and so many cases of Black people being shot for literally doing nothing, for sleeping or for having a toy gun. And so when people say, oh, well, people, specifically police, say, oh, no, we were threatened by them. They were threatening. They're not threatening. You just want to justify your actions based on a racial profiling. And that's just kind of how I see it, because they're constantly making a lot of excuses for the unjust actions that are happening. But then when they don't apply that to everyone, then that's when it comes in with oh, that's their right. That's their right. They can do that. But those rights don't apply to everyone.
I totally agree with you. And also the whole thing about being threatened by, innocent people is that, even during the Black Lives Matter protests, they were armed with big shields, with bulletproof vests. And none of the protesters, almost none, carried anything, even like a small gun. There was no violence coming from the protesters, but they were shooting out rubber bullets to people who didn't have bulletproof shields, didn't have shields, didn't have bulletproof vests or anything. They were just marching with signs. And that just kind of shows, you weren't feeling threatened. That's not what was happening. The most they were doing to you was yelling or screaming. But that was not you feeling threatened. It was you enforcing your power and showing that who's the real who actually has the power. Oh, it's us, the police force do, and not you. So it was trying to trying to stop the protest from happening by showing them oh yeah, we have the power here.
Ooh, yes, and one quick little information about rubber bullets. Rubber bullets are about this big, and they're meant to be shot at the ground and then hit the legs of people to stop them, but they're being shot point blank. And because I've been to a few protests, and I've met people in person who have been shot in the face by those rubber bullets, and they've known people who have gone blind from that. And there's people who have literally died from being shot by these rubber bullets because they're huge and they're being advertised as safe and, oh, it's rubber. But when you're shooting that at someone's face and you're super close to them, that does a lot of damage.
Yeah, it's just like falling flat on a pool of water. Although it's water, it seems like soft and you just go into it, just like rubber. Oh, like rubber is soft. Well, if you hit water flat, it's like cement. You're literally hitting cement. So rubber bullets being shot point blank can do as much damage as regular bullets can. So
Yeah, someone was hit in the head with the rubber bullet and they have like severe brain damage now. So it's not safe. It's not safe for people who are not even armed, who don't have any protection against themselves besides maybe possibly a sign. You know, they are not allowing us to exercise our freedom of speech. And I don't think it's all police officers, but it's like, you know, the majority, maybe not even the majority, just like what they stand for. And like, you know, what they are partaking in, you know, what activity, like how they handle different situations and how they were trained to handle different situations is not right. It does not ensure equal opportunity for all. It just ensures equal opportunity for the people who are privileged in society.
also, coming back shortly to the question of the right to bear arms, I think that there's an issue with with civilians having arms, but then the police being aggressive towards civilians who legally are able to have guns. And to recall the tragic death of Breonna Taylor, her death was pretty much started by her boyfriend who thought there was someone in their house, and he rightfully and legally could protect his property against the intruders, but the intruders were the police. So, and they, to be honest, I think illegally arrested him, mainly because he was in the right to protect himself with arms that he was legally allowed to have. And because of this aggression, also Breonna Taylor died. And I think there's this huge like pothole or like loophole in this system where you don't really know how to react to these situations because there's no black or white answer to them.
Mm-hmm. And they even already had a suspect in custody at that time too. Mm-hmm. They already knew who actually, you know, did the crime, but they still broke into their house. And Breonna Taylor's boyfriend or husband?
I think boyfriend. I think.
Boyfriend. Okay. Yeah, he had the right to bear arms. He had like a gun. He thought someone was breaking into his house because police usually are not allowed to break into their house unless they have causation or if it's with a warrant. And so, you know, he had no idea. And so he was just defending himself against police who are probably heavily armed, or like, sorry, not heavily armed, heavily like armored, probably had like bulletproof vests and everything. And so.
And I believe they had a warrant, although it was for a different house. And as you said, they already had the police in custody. Sorry, not the police, sorry. They had the suspect in custody. Mm-hmm. So they not only broke into the wrong house and fired off several bullets, because Breonna was sleeping, and I think 8 bullets hit her and killed her. I'm not 100% sure on that. Although her boyfriend thought, oh, someone's breaking into my house, I'm going to defend myself, and yet he was still arrested. And so that there is that big double standard isn't exactly the right word, but if everyone's talking about, oh, people have the right to defend themselves, you also have to bring into fact who they're defending themselves from. Because if it's the police that you have to defend yourself from, that is a very, very, I can't think of the word, but it's a very harmful and quite frankly frightening idea that is who your gun is going to have to protect you from, if you can.
Adding on to that, I read that her boyfriend actually shot at the foot, which is what like you should usually do. Like he didn't do it like actually at the officers, while the officers shot like multiple bullets at the house like blindly. It wasn't even like, so it was not right.
Yeah, and just as a last comment, I would say even though like, you know, even if they had probable cause to enter their house, it also just shows how police training could be improved and how they shouldn't be shooting blindly at someone's house, even if they are like, even if there was no race involved in this. Just the fact that they came in and then they shot at, you know, they shot blindly after getting one shot to the foot. You know, they shouldn't feel threatened like that, and they should understand that people have the right to bear arms and should be trained for situations like this. Yeah. So if anyone has any like last comments to say before we move on to the next topic? No? Okay. So now we'll just be discussing what Black Lives Matter, what the Black Lives Matter movement is and what are its goals. So the Black Lives Matter movement is advocating for non-violent civil disobedience that protest against police brutality and all racially motivated violence against African American people. It was founded on July 13, 2013 by Alicia Garza, Patrice Coulars, and Opal Tomati. I think I pronounced that right. So it began as a hashtag on social media after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in July 2013, who was shot and killed. Oh yeah, who shot and killed AA teen Trayvon Martin a year earlier. In 2016, the Black Lives Matter movement and other organizations called for the decarceration in the U.S., reparations for slavery, and an end to mass surveillance, investment in public education, and community control of the police. They aim to empower residents and communities of color, and recently the movement is advocating for the defunding of the police and investing in alternative emergency responders. It also voices support and brings awareness to different causes, different minority issues in the United States, such as LGBTQ rights and activism, feminism, immigration reform, and economic justice for different groups. And as of 2020, it is one of the largest movements in US history. And as we saw like in the news for the past couple of months, it's really gained traction. And even though it's like slowly been dying down, I feel like it's done a lot for our nation. It showed, you know, the flaws that exist in our police system and in our laws itself. So yeah. And then what can you do to help this movement? So there are petitions to sign. There is the Justice for Breonna Taylor. The White House recently made an official petition for Breonna Taylor. And there's also one from change.org. And you can also educate yourself with books and movies. The 13th on Netflix and YouTube, LA 92. Yeah, if you want, you can just read them. But yeah. So Breonna Taylor's murders have not been arrested, and that petition, the White House petition, met its goal, but it doesn't hurt to add any more signatures just to show show more support. And make sure to check your email after signing to verify your signature and make sure that it's, you know, that you've actually signed it. And the 13th is a show about mass incarceration, especially of Black people. And LA 92 is about the 1992 LA riots following the acquittal of 4 police officers who beat Rodney King, a Black man. I Am Not Your Negro discusses Black representation throughout history and is named after James Baldwin's unfinished last work. Between the World and Me is a memoir by Coates written to his son that describes the barriers, hardships, and struggles that he will go through as a Black man. Just Mercy reviews the broken justice system and focuses on a specific case that Brian Stevenson worked on. If Beale Street Could Talk is a fiction and discusses the biases in our country, the broken justice system, and the struggles of Black people in America. And there's also places you could donate to. The NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund seeks structural changes to expand democracy, eliminate disparities, and achieve racial justice through litigation, advocacy, and public education. And Color of Change works to move decision makers into corporations and governments. So does anyone have any questions about any of the ways that you could help out?
I have a few suggestions to help with ways to help out.
Yeah.
One of the main things to remember is that this is not a one and done thing. This isn't something that you check off your checklist and be like, oh, okay, done, don't have to do anymore. Because being Black is not something that you can take off. It's not something that you can stop being. This is an everyday thing for us. We are constantly having to fight for our rights. And especially now, if you look at the past few months and way past that, we are still fighting for our right to exist and to be able to walk down the street, to sleep, to play with toys, to jog, and not feel threatened and to not feel scared for our lives. Because with the Black Lives Matter movement, you don't get to pick and choose which lives, because the Black Lives Matter movement is for anyone, no matter what your gender is or your sexuality or anything like that. It's for every single Black person out there, everyone who is considered less for their skin color. So when you hear your friends saying something racist, and even if they don't notice it or they don't mean any harm by it, call them out or just say, hey, that's not okay, and here's why. Explain to them, help them understand, so the next time someone around them says something, they can help that person. Because not everybody is trying to hurt someone or is trying to be racist. But if every day you try and be better and you try and help someone understand, hey, you shouldn't discriminate against someone because of their skin color, that is going to help. Because oppression will never end, and that is a sad fact. But you can do something. There is never a time where you can't do anything. No matter how small, it will mean something to someone. Because you could literally save someone's life by helping someone around you, because they may not know what they're saying is bad, or they might just not care. And yes, you can't change everyone's point of view, and because that's not possible. You can't control the way people think, but you can control the way you think and your actions and what you do. And if you help the people around you be better, then not only will that help yourself, but that's going to help tons of other people.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And yeah, does anyone have like any other organizations or petitions or like shows that they recommend people watch? Because like I've heard I've heard people say like, oh, I'm kind of tired of the Black Lives Matter movement, or I'm like, I don't feel like participating anymore, and they just do it for a couple of weeks and then stop thinking about it. But like, Black people, that it's their actual life, it's their livelihood, and they have to go through this every day. And the fact that you have to go through this inconvenience for 2 weeks and can choose to leave it says a lot. And so knowing your privilege and how you can use your privilege to help others and help different groups, including like, Black Lives Matter movement and like any other group, you should always be aware of your privilege and use that to help other people towards like social reform, educational reform, anything.
I 100% agree with you. When people say, "Oh, I'm tired of seeing all these names," or "I'm tired of seeing all these petitions, can't we just go back to normal?" If your normal is the regular onslaught of oppression and discrimination and murder, literally, because people aren't just losing their lives are being taken from them. And if you're tired of hearing about that, do something about it. Because as you said, like, because for me, I'm a Black African American, and both sides of my family are African American. So this is our life. This is our day to day. And while that may not be that for you, you have to realize that when you're not Black, especially if you're white, you can walk away from this. At the end of the day, you get to go home and be like, oh, I don't have to worry about this. I don't have to experience this every day. I don't have to be afraid for my life. And I hope more and more people will continue to recognize that and continue to not only feel sympathy, but start doing something. Because you can feel things all you want, but if you don't actually do anything about it, then what's the point? Because as that last sentence says on this slide, be actively anti-racist. Because you can never, ever say something racist in your life, which isn't really that accurate. Someone will at least say something, even if they don't mean it. But even if you're never actively trying to hurt anyone or actively being racist, if you let people around you do that, that's just going to further that and further that oppression and further that hatred and further that discrimination. So do something about it. If you're so tired of it, help and just do more and be more.
Yeah, I think that there was a public comment saying that the best thing we can do is to educate ourselves and our children or the people around us. And I totally agree with that because I'm from Poland, which is a very much like 99% white, like really just monoculture. And so the conversation of race doesn't even occur, even though, and like, it's a given that people are racist, but because it is a monoculture and there's no education on race and diversity, you don't know anything. And I think that especially when it comes to being not Black and or being surrounded or being in a community that doesn't get enough education about diversity and the topic of, for example, Black Lives Matter and oppression against African Americans, I think it's especially important to educate the people around you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to follow up on like what Raven said. At the end of the day, like if you're not Black, you can go home and you just like don't have to think about it after you decide not to think about it. But it's like, if you're tired of it after 2 weeks, imagine what Black people feel like for their entire lives. It's if you're tired of it, then you should make a difference. And if you say like, oh, I want my feed to go back to normal, I don't want to keep seeing all these like petitions and all these Black Lives Matter stuff, well then you won't see it if you do something about it, if you help the cause, and if you take some action and actively be anti-racist. Because before all of this, many of us, including myself, like, we're living in this, ignorance state, not just like ignorance, but we just didn't know, we weren't exposed to it. But like after the movement started picking up a lot of traction, a lot of us started doing our own research and becoming more involved with it, and I feel like it's really changed the way that I perceive, like, my community and America as a whole. And a lot of people want to go back to that state of like ignorance is bliss, but people are still suffering because you choose not to do anything about it. And so being actively anti-racist even in your own community, in your own home or anything, is doing a lot. Oh, that's great. Yeah, I'm glad that you like, take the initiative to try and like make a positive difference like where you can. And that's really great. Thank you. Does anyone else have anything they wanted to say?
One little thing that I did want to say, which we've all touched on in some way, shape, or form, but one of the biggest things that I feel will help, not only with the movement, but to help better people as a whole, is we need to not only reform our police system and especially our justice system, but our education system. Because a lot of this starts in school. If you grow up constantly being taught this whitewashed version of history where you never actually learn all of the horrible things that America has done, you're never gonna understand why things are offensive or why things are wrong or why you shouldn't do something. And so what really needs to change in the education system is that they need to teach you about slavery, because there have been books in plenty of schools, especially in the South, where they literally in those books taught that slavery was good. They taught that slaves and their masters sat together down at dinner and they laughed, they sang, they had fun. One of the reasons why, especially centered in the South, there's a lot of white supremacy and a lot of animosity and hate towards Black people is because they are literally taught that. Because yes, there's a lot of people learn to be racist from their parents or their friends or their school system. And ultimately, they still choose to remain racist, because no matter who teaches you, if you choose to go after someone, you need to be held accountable for that. But at the same time, with holding people accountable and with getting those consequences for people's actions, we need to take the root of at least part of those actions, and we need to change that. And it's not just for Black history, but history of Native Americans and history in Japanese history and all the things that have been done to oppressed groups in America and minorities, because America has a lot of blood on its hands and a lot of very bad history that unless you grow up with your family telling you this or you do your own research, you're not gonna know. And it's so horrible that we grow up being taught that the oppressors are the saviors and that the people who have basically been the cause of so much suffering are the people that we have statues of. They're the people who are on our money, the people that we look up to. And so if we take that education and we correct it and we teach actual history, that will help so much with stopping a lot of people from going down that path and adopting that hate, because they'll actually understand what has happened and what is happening.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. It's just like, especially before, because this past year I took AP US history, and I did learn a lot about the slavery, but the way that the curriculum was based, it was like my teacher was really good. He did try to give us a holistic review of really what happened. But the way that curriculum is based, it's like, after 1865, slavery just abruptly ended. Nothing happened after that. There maybe was like racism, still like racist sentiments, but there wasn't any like actual slavery going on. And then after the Civil Rights Act in 1965, segregation gone. Like there was no racism anymore. That's kind of how you perceived U.S. history, because no one ever told us that there were consequences to these actions that still last to today. And another thing I learned through being an active member of the Black Lives Matter movement is that a lot of the civil rights pictures are in color, and they are not black and white. Like for so long, I thought like I've never seen MLK in color, and because history has been like shown as the civil rights movement was so long ago, and there's no way that racist sentiments still exists today because it was so long ago. It's already been taken care of. But the fact is, Rosa Parks was still alive into the 2010s era. Like she was still alive. Like it didn't happen that long ago. And the sooner we realize this, the first Black woman who went to school, I think she's still alive today. Like the first Black woman to go to an all white school. Sorry.
Well, she's not only alive, she's in her 60s. She's pretty young in the grand scheme of things, because that was only in the late 60s that she went. Ruby Bridges. She was the first girl to go to a formerly segregated school in the South. But yeah, if you look at the curriculum, especially U.S. history, it's all very whitewashed. I remember during elementary school, whenever we would learn about the Native Americans and Thanksgiving, and every time I would be like, this does not seem correct, because they teach you that the Pilgrims came and the Native Americans welcomed them and everybody helped each other out and it was a grand jolly time, but it was definitely not what it was. And then now during APUSH, the way that we learned it was kind of like Black people were slaves, then slavery ended, then they kind of disappear until the Harlem Renaissance, and then we don't hear about them again until the Civil Rights Movement. And it's like you just don't. And then also Asian history, you don't learn about any of them until they're like, it's something prominent that's happening to them. So you see throughout history, all of these minority groups are just being brushed over until there's something really important about them, and they just disappear again. Versus white history, we learn a bunch of random facts that nobody really needs to know.
Yeah. And the fact that we have a whole Columbus Day commemorating like the guy who came in and pretty much stole Native American land because he didn't view these view Native Americans as actual people. And so just knowing that there are different sides of history and that not everything is just black and white like we think it is, that there's actually a lot of gray area and that there's a lot more to history than we think, and we shouldn't be learning some random facts that we won't remember in the future. And we should be learning about different perspectives of history, because history is always written in the perspective of the oppressor, because the oppressed will never get a chance to voice their opinions. And so we should take that into account when we try to learn what happened in history and realize that, history is American history is not perfect. We are not perfect today. And there is still a lot of racist sentiments that exist.
Exactly. And since the way that they teach us is they teach it as if there's an end to it, which there's not. Because touching on what was said about how we learn a bunch of random stuff when it comes to white history, and a lot of that's lies too. Like George Washington, he was a slave owner. Most of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, they were slave owners. And one thing that I think is important to point out, especially with the wording of it, is that while slavery was abolished in 1865, it didn't just end. All the slaves weren't just released. It's kind of like think about it like this: drinking alcohol is illegal in America unless you turn 21, but people still drink alcohol when they're below 21. So that's kind of like definitely a much less parallel. But if you're trying to explain it to someone in a very simple term, that's kind of how I think about it. Because even years after slavery was abolished, those slaves, those former slaves, were not able to leave because they didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't have money, they didn't have education. And if they were able to leave that plantation or to leave those owners, they could get killed, they could get rounded up and used for slavery again. Because like my great grandmother was the daughter of a slave, and she was enslaved after 1865. And so it's very important to realize that even with these laws, even with the civil rights movement, nothing ended. And so when people say, oh, there's no racism anymore, racism isn't here, that in itself is ignorance, because that shows that since you haven't faced it, and since you haven't felt that towards you, then suddenly it's gone. But in reality, it's so institutionalized and so ingrained in our society that when we are faced with it, most people just think it's an everyday occurrence, an everyday thing, and not see the problem with it, which is why it's such a big problem, because it is everywhere. So I just feel like that's something that is very important to recognize, that there is so much ignorance because the root of everything has spread so much, but where you would learn about it and where you would be taught teaches it as if it never existed.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And I think that's a good ending point for our webinar for today. Does anyone have anything else they would like to add, or no? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming today, and it was really great to have like this, to learn more about the Black Lives Matter movement and why we are protesting for Black lives and the history of oppression and police brutality. And so I'd like to thank everyone for coming and speaking today, or just listening and learning more and discussing. So yeah, I'll see you all later.
I just wanted to quickly mention that our next webinar is going to be on the 8th, and we're going to touch on this topic a little bit more.
Yes. Okay.
But yeah, thank you all for attending. A special thank you to Raven for coming and talking more about her perspective.
Thank you for having me. This has been a very great experience, and I commend you all for setting this up. And thank you very much for not only having me, but for having this.
Thank you. Yeah. All right, then I guess that concludes our webinar. I'll see you hopefully on the 8th. Bye.
Bye.